From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. From the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens on the cattle markets. He will dig into the latest USDA Cattle-on-Feed report and the heifer feeding numbers in particular, which imply a further delay in major cow herd expansion. Then K-State's Walt Fick will talk about the slow growth of native pastures so far this spring and why you cow herd managers might want to think about delaying turnout until those grasses come on. He'll also talk about the possible need to adjust stocking rates if the forecast for a dry summer holds. And on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State's Joe Gerken on management steps to keep moss from growing on farm ponds. All that here on Agriculture Today. You are tuned into Agriculture Today, and we're glad to have you along to get things going for a new week as we pick up on the cattle markets. And this week, we turn to an agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center. Again, that's based in Denver, and it's co-sponsored by K-State, among other land-grant universities. We talk once more with Tyler Cozzens, and one of our intents here is to mine a little deeper into that cattle-on-feed report out a little bit over a week ago, and some of the indicators on heifer retention and feeding. But let's look back at this past trading week, if we might, Tyler, and we more or less see that maybe there was some weakness creeping in the cash feeder cattle trade. Cash feds, on the other hand, had a pretty good round of it.
There was, yeah. So kind of a little bit of a recap on the markets this last week. Looking at Dodge City, Kansas feeder cattle prices, roughly about the 500, 900 pound feeder cattle or feeder steer prices sold about $2 to $5 lower over the last week. Specifically looking at those 500 pound feeder steers, they sold about at about $180 to $182 per hundredweight. 600 pound feeder steers, they ranged about $165 to $170. 700 pounds were in the mid to 150 range. And then those heavier weights, 800, 900 pounds, were in the $144 to $152 range. Now, quickly looking at the 800, 900 feeder heifers, they were about even to maybe $2 lower for the week, which is about $140 per hundredweight there. Now, kind of looking at the fed cattle side of things, looking specifically at the 5-area average price, USDA reported formula and contract-based prices for live steers and heifers this week ranged about $140 to $146 per hundredweight. Now, last week prices ranged about $141 to $144. So this last week we had a wider range of prices compared to about 2 weeks ago. But one of the things I want to point out was actually on February 22nd, we actually saw the highest fed price for the year, and that was $145 per hundredweight. Now, last week, daily prices reached over that $145 mark. They actually peaked at $145.86 per hundredweight. So this set a new high for the year. So definitely some positive news there. Now, on the dressed basis side of things, steers and heifers were $219 to $223 per hundredweight versus about $217 to $222 last week. So slightly better from the prior week. But overall, we're still seeing some strength in this cash cattle prices, despite the bearish tone from that recent cattle-on-feed report.
That cattle-on-feed report, and the numbers are fairly well heralded by now, stronger than expected placements, etc. You have taken this one further and really examined what is going on as far as impacts on herd rebuilding across the country, and talk about that and weave into it the drought that seems to be evident in just about anything right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, this drought situation is not showing any signs of breaking, so there's a lot of concern kind of surrounding that. But as you pointed out, these placements were much higher than expected. They were much higher than industry expectations. Even outside of the pre-report estimates, analysts were actually expecting placements to be down about 4% to as much as 13%. But instead, placements came in about even with a year ago, right? So this cause for higher placements in March is likely tied to this persistent drought. It just continues to grip much of the key cattle-producing regions in the western U.S. The concern is that the drought may continue to hinder any herd rebuilding efforts. right? So this lingering drought is likely starting to force some producers to change their approach to herd rebuilding. Why I say this is it's starting to show up in some of the numbers of heifers going into feedlots, right? Those heifers likely were being retained as replacements, but I think these producers have probably started to shift into these heifers into feedlots, possibly due to a lack of available feed supplies. So this trend of higher heifers into feedlots is shown in quarterly data by class that was released in the April Cattle-on-Feed report. Mm-hmm. Now, kind of looking specifically at this quarterly data that USDA releases, so as of April 1, this quarterly cattle-on-feed report by class, so we're looking at specifically steers and heifers, we're about even with last year. So compared to the 5-year average, though, heifers on feed were about 2 to 3% higher. So we're seeing a kind of a persistent trend of more heifers in the feedlot. And so this has been occurring for the last 2 years, and it's likely tied to this drought conditions here. And we're also seeing this has also kept weekly heifer slaughter above typical levels. For example, year to date, weekly heifer slaughter has been tracking about 2% above 2021. So this is an indication that female cattle numbers continue to decline during the drought. Now, just as we're seeing higher heifer slaughter, there has also been higher beef cow slaughter as well. Those numbers are up about 18% year to date over last year. So kind of the main point and takeaway from all this, is as a result of this drought, the percentage of heifers on feed continues to remain elevated, and we're seeing beef cow slaughter remain high, which is likely stalling any herd rebuilding efforts.
And the market reaction to the Cattle-on-Feed report, again, released over a week ago, what's been the general take of the market to those numbers and typically looking at the longer term here?
Yeah, so kind of a little bit of the reaction with this is that higher placement number, it pressured prices initially first part of the week here. And a lot of this is just it's due to more cattle getting front loaded in the supply chain. We saw a similar trend in the last 2 years, during this drought. Just this front loading of cattle is seen in the number of cattle on feed over 90 days and 120 days. Specifically over half, about 53% of the cattle on feed as of April 1 were on feed over 90 days. This is 6.4 million head. Now about 37% of the cattle on feed have been on feed over 120 days. That's 4.5 million head. Now these are levels that are near records that we've seen over the last 2 years during this drought period. This also suggests that there will be plenty of cattle supplies this summer and early fall. Right, so these ample cattle on feed in the supply chain, it pressured live cattle futures prices, and what we saw through the week was futures contracts struggled to gain any traction. Futures prices finished the week on a lower note. So although the recent cattle on feed report has pressured futures prices, as we discussed, the cash market has been holding strong. I think this is a good sign that demand is still robust, especially as we approach Memorial Day. This is usually kind of considered kind of the marking point of the start for grilling season. And one of the things we watch for as an indication of beef demand is specifically retail beef feature activity. And there's a report that USDA AMS releases that gives us a little bit of an indication of what's kind of going on in the market.
And that is, in fact, a routine report. It's weekly data from the Agricultural Marketing Service of the USDA. Take us into that a bit, if you would, and go over what those numbers are telling us, Tyler.
Yeah, and as you said, Eric, it is a weekly report, and specifically they're looking at retail beef activity at major retail outlets. And one of the data points that is of interest is the feature rate activity for beef. Now, USDA Ag Marketing Service defines the feature rate as the amount of sampled stores advertising any reported beef item that week. So, for example, feature rate activity for retail beef is typically about 74% through the first quarter of the year, meaning that of the stores sampled, 74% were advertising beef that week. Now, last year, the feature rate activity was 75%, so about a typical level that we would expect for retail beef advertising. Now, last week, the most recent data available shows that feature rate activity was actually 75%. Or about 10% below typical levels. Now, this isn't too unexpected, right? Because we're a few weeks away from Memorial Day. But as we get closer to the grilling season, we would expect this feature rate activity to start to increase in the coming weeks as retailers start to feature more beef in the meat case. Now, typically, the cuts that we'll see featured are the chuck, round, loin, and ground beef. So on that note, what I want to kind of point out was looking at retail meat prices, consumers are facing higher prices, especially beef. the most recent retail beef price data from USDA's Economic Research Services for the month of March. And that data showed that actually the retail beef prices in March were $7.76 per pound. This is up $1.20 per pound from last year. Now, beef prices are expected to remain elevated in April. And why I say that is, when we're looking at these wholesale prices as a gauge for April retail prices, for those cuts typically featured during this grilling season, the chuck, the round, the loin, and ground beef, what we're seeing is actually that prices are down for the chuck and loin, but looking at the round and ground beef, those are both up. I think it's also important to note that ground beef hit a record price level in March of $4.76 per pound. That's 17% above 2021. So the ground beef prices will likely remain high in April. And so lastly, what we're seeing is that the inflationary environment that we're living in, also coupled with the slowing in the herd rebuilding efforts, will likely keep beef prices elevated.
The gratifying part of this, though, Tyler, is that demand is still holding well in the face of those higher prices. And as long as that is the case, well, producers maybe can rest a little easier here.
Yes, I agree. I think the demand picture is definitely robust moving forward, and curious to see how it shakes out over the summer as we start to kick off the grilling season.
Very important time of year for beef producers and consumers, for that matter. Tyler, thanks for going through all of that with us. Good indicators as to what the markets might be looking at and thinking. And we will talk again soon. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
He's an agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center. That's Tyler Cozzens. You can follow the material he pulls together, as well as that of his colleagues at LMIC, on their website, lmic.info. We'll return shortly on this Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now, and we've been discussing at length the dry weather, recent rains notwithstanding, that has persisted for so long now and has affected all kinds of growth out there on the land, including our pasture lands. Brings up a number of questions about pasture management moving forward in this grazing season. We have brought by once more range and pasture management specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Walt Fick, to take that on. Walt, one thing we want to touch upon right away here is the slow growth of our grasslands out there, our native grasses in particular. Is it behind pace as you look at what's going on out there?
Well, I sure think so, Eric. I'd say 10 to 14 days behind normal, whatever normal is, And some of the other plants that I use is some of these shrubs, wild plums. They're just starting to bloom good. They're, normally that's early to mid-April. And the red buds, they're trees like that they're late as well. So I think our grasslands indeed are behind. You drive down the road or get out and walk around, you're not going to see a lot of growth. There's some of the forbs are starting to grow because they're a little bit earlier. In the cool season grass, if you have Kentucky bluegrass, it's greening up. But the warm seasons just haven't shown much growth at all. Now, areas that were burned earlier, those stands are starting to grow, but they're just kind of sitting there as well. I think they need some more moisture and sunlight before they're ready to graze.
So it really is mostly about the lack of soil moisture then.
Yeah, and I think, you look at the long term, it's been dry since last fall. We're building quite a deficit. The wind has been blowing a lot. That dries things out as well. And I think, it's varied a little bit during the wintertime, but by and large, we've had some cooler weather, too. Not real cold, but cool enough where that also slows down the growth of these native warm season pastures.
It leads then to the question, when should an individual turn out, either the cow herd or stocker calves on that grass? Should they hold off until there's something more substantial for those herds to eat?
Well, I'd say the short answer is yes. Normally, depending on where you're at in the state, we may start to stock, in the southern Flint Hills, April 15th is kind of a real target date. Northern Flint Hills, sometime around the 1st of May, and you get, north central and northwest Kansas, it might be even 2 weeks later than that. It might be the middle of May. So you got a range, but But that turnout date, when the pastures are ready to graze, it'll vary from year to year, probably at least 2 or 3 weeks. And this year we're in a situation where it looks like things are going to be late. So I think, indeed, we may need to do some things to delay going to grass if we can. If
we turn out too early, does that cause a detriment to the grass itself and something that continues then throughout the rest of the grazing season?
Well, yeah, it can. Traditionally we've talked about range readiness is a term we've used to talk about when we should turn animals out, and I've different theories on that, but I kind of think about, well, maybe plant height is probably the easiest thing to judge, and I'd like to see 2 to 4 inches of growth before I turn very many animals out there. If you look at individual grass plants, maybe that's 3 leaves. That might be a critical stage, but I say, just looking at it, 2 to 4 inches, and you got to think about, how much is being produced out there, and when you turn an animal out, how much does it need to consume? And a 1,200-pound cow with a calf by her side, maybe it was born back in February or March right now, they might consume close to 40 pounds a day, dry matter. So that's a lot of forage, and if they've got to travel over a large distance, they're going to spend a lot of time grazing, and it's not going to help flush the cows back and put much gain weight back on them. Same way with the calves. Again, we've done studies. Of course, like the double stalking, the intensive early stalking stuff, and we can graze these pastures pretty hard in the early season as long as we get off and provide rest in the late season. But still, you need a certain amount of biomass out there before you turn animals out. And with the weather predictions that we've seen, they're talking at least next 30 to 90 days. You never know how accurate those might be, but they're saying it's going to be warmer and drier than normal in most of Kansas. That being the case, if rather than having maybe average forage production, we're going to have less than that, and less than that may be as much as 30 to 50%, depending on what soil you're talking about, ecological sites we call those, and what part of the state that you're in. But it can be a fairly significant reduction in available forage if it continues to be dry.
Well, that leads right into the other primary question we wanted to take on today. In view of that outlook, and if it does hold true that we have a warmer and dry summer ahead, should a producer earnestly think about scaling back on their intended stocking rates, which is always a difficult decision, Walt?
That's one approach that can be done. I think the more, I'll call it, say, progressive people, managers, probably have a drought plan in place where they've had target dates where they've decided if such and such happens, and it's usually related to precipitation. And that first target date might be maybe the middle of April. And things look kind of bleak middle of April in most places in the state. I think right now we're over 79% of the state has some level of drought. And, they may make a decision then, well, if maybe I'm not even going to start the year normal, I'm going to cut back even to begin with. I think another critical date, if you think about target dates, probably be the middle of June. And that's a point in time where for most of the state, half of our forage production ought to have occurred by middle of June. And if that hasn't happened, then you're definitely probably not going to have enough. Even if it starts raining after that, you're probably not going to have enough forage production to make up that deficit. So, you could go into the year with the idea, I'm going to reduce stocking rates right away. Others may decide, maybe they're more flexible than that, maybe particularly with stockers, because we can, you can sell them about any time and get by pretty well. You could start normally, but then if things turn dry and the cattle are getting ahead of the available forage, you can start reducing numbers at that point in time.
How much to reduce? That's going to be at the discretion of the producer. Are there any general guidelines to go by there?
Well, again, I look at what, kind of long-term, what average forage production is, and again, it varies depending on that soil type. But if we have, let's say, compared to normal production, if we have below normal production, we're talking about as much as 30 to 50% reduction in livestock numbers. Now, if you don't do that, of course, what happens then, rather than grazing, 50% utilization like we normally target. Well, if you don't cut back, well, it's going to be more like 70 or 80%. And, of course, then that has some consequences, for a subsequent year. What you can do, though, is you can decide, I don't have 150 days of grazing. I'm going to have so much out there. Maybe it's 100 or 110 days, and then I'm going to be out of forage. I've utilized as much as I want to, and I'm going to have to take them elsewhere.
So you can shift your mindset. Maybe you've been full season. Now you think about a quasi-intensive early stocking approach here, perhaps.
Yes, you could do that, and like I say, that's fairly easy to do with stockers. I know that Keith Harmony, our range scientist at Hazel, has looked at higher stalking rates even with cows, and it's worked quite well there as well. Basically an intensive early and then removing part of them and leaving some of them out there even. But that can work as well. But bottom line is you're still reducing your overall stalking rate when you do that. The other thing we can think about, though, is again, we're sitting here and the grass is just not quite ready, so we need to defer our grazing use, put it off for a period of time, even though I know people are anxious to get their livestock out, quit feeding them. But if you have the opportunity, if you can still feed them for a while, or maybe you have a cool season grass that you can graze, brome, fescue, maybe a cover crop, graze those for a while, delay or defer for a couple of weeks at least, before you go on native grass, and that can be beneficial as well.
It comes down to, in closing, Walt, producers needing to be, they need to be nimble about every grazing season, but more so this year, and watching point by point what's happening with the weather and what's happening with their grass, and monitor that pretty closely.
Yeah, they do need to be flexible, I think, just year in, year out, because this drought business is not just something that happens once in a while. It's actually fairly frequent when you start looking at it. And so they need to be aware of that. And like I say, having a drought plan is a good way to go. I've always encouraged cow-calf producers to, rather than, running as many cows as they can, maybe cut back to 70% of what that carrying capacity would be, make up the difference then with stalkers in a good year. Then if it gets dry, get rid of the stalkers, and you haven't had to touch your cow herd yet. So that's a pretty practical way to approach it.
Think about your alternatives, producers, as the expectations remain for a dry grazing season ahead. And Walt, thank you as always for coming over and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Walt Fick, Range and Pasture Management Specialist with K-State Research and Extension, discussing a few things to ponder as far as your grazing management heading into the coming summer grazing season. One more break right here now. When we come back, we'll have our weekly wildlife management segment for you. This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. We are back now on Agriculture Today and around to another wildlife management segment for you. And along with us once again is Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, K-State, Joe Gerken. And we're looking at farm ponds once again, Joe, and that really is your lot in life this time of the year. Weed problems common in ponds, and those start to manifest themselves pretty quickly now as the weather warms up, don't they?
Yep. This is the time of year we're getting a lot of calls. People are starting to see a lot of weeds in their ponds. So getting a lot of calls, trying to figure out what's going on and what we can do to kind of mitigate the problem, help get ahead of it so we're not fighting it all year.
What are the primary weed species out there that are most problematic?
Sure. We see a lot of American pondweed in this area, but by far what I get called for the most is filamentous algae. A lot of people around the state call it pond moss. It's the green stuff that kind of shows up overnight, grows on the bottom of the pond actually, collects air, and floats up to the top. So you can look out in your beautiful pond, the next day it can be covered in this filamentous algae or moss.
And that's not helpful to the aquatic life, is it?
No, it gets in too high a density, so it can quickly get out of hand. One of the biggest problems we see is when it dies, bacteria eat it up, and that uses up oxygen. Obviously, fish and other organisms in the water need that oxygen. So we want to make sure we can get it under control and get it out of the pond as quickly as we can, keep that pond healthy.
Well, control probably starts with understanding the cause of that growth, then, doesn't it?
It sure does. And so In Kansas, there are two main causes that I see a lot. The first one is that every pond wants to fill in. If we leave a pond alone long enough, sediment's eventually going to fill that pond in. And so in Kansas, that's relatively quick. The average pond lifespan is about 20 years before it needs maintenance. Now, some last 5 years, some last 50, but on average, it's about 20 years. And what you start to see is ponds fill in over time. And as they get shallower, more sunlight can hit the bottom. Plants love sunlight. So the more sunlight we have hitting the bottom, the more plant growth we start to see.
Also, nutrient runoff into those ponds can contribute?
Sure. So one of the big words that we use a lot in pond management is eutrophication, and that's a big word that means too many nutrients in the pond. Some of the main sources we see in a HOA or a golf course, you might see people fertilizing their lawns. That's going to be, kind of a man-made problem. We also see a lot of runoff from agricultural fields where the water in the watershed, so not necessarily going directly into the pond, but somewhere in that watershed, and then rain is going to bring it down into the pond. So nitrogen and phosphorus are the two main components that we're looking at with plant growth. When those values start to get too high, if you fertilize your garden, you get really big tomatoes. If you fertilize your pond, you get a bunch of algae. So we want big tomatoes, we don't want algae. So we try to keep those nutrients under control in our pond as much as we can.
Then some means of cultural management would be called for here.
Yep. One of the easiest things you can do is allow plants, grasses to grow up around your pond. Those plants are going to take up a lot of the nutrients that would otherwise be washing in. So let them grow up 3-4 feet around the pond at least, more if you can allow it. Another important thing is you can mow strips in if you want access for fishing or swimming, that's okay. But anywhere you can allow it to grow up, that's going to help keep some of those nutrients out.
And as far as livestock access, cattle in particular, to that pond, that can be a big contributor here, you say?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things we want to keep in mind with pond management is making sure we're managing them for our goals. So if your goal is only to have cattle access the pond and you don't care about fish or anything else, that's important. Let your cattle go. But if you have a pond that you want to control some of this plant growth, keeping your cattle fenced out, and then having your water pumped to a trough that they can drink out of really is beneficial for the cattle. There was some research done back in 2002 that shows that cattle growth rates over the course of a year increase somewhere around 10 to 20% in cleaner waters where the cows aren't allowed to access it. The other thing is that cows are adding in nutrients, right, through their waste. That's another source of fertilizer for the plants. So we can see too much growth in that aspect as well.
What we want to do when you're with us next time, Joe, is look at the situation where weeds are already there. What can be done to control them? We will tap into that when you come back by. Thank you.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Joe Gerken is a fisheries and aquatics extension specialist at Kansas State University. That's our weekly wildlife management segment and our time for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.